So welcome to Business Technology Management, Business Information System Risk, Security and Audit, BTM 440. I'm Professor Marc-André Léger of the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University in Montreal. And so this corresponds to the first part of the lecture for week 3 in this class. So again, I'm Marc-André, professor, teaching this instructor for this course. So in lesson 3, this is what we're covering. So this is the PowerPoint from the original book, Fundamentals of Information System Security. So this is the required book for this course. And so what we're covering is lesson 3, malicious attacks, threats, and vulnerabilities. And so in this lecture, so this again, because our course is combined into 12 weeks of material, and then the review on week 13, and then later the final exam. So the chapters in the book were sort of combined in some lectures. And so in today's lecture, we're actually covering this part. And then there'll be a second video that's going to be made available to you that's covering the second part of this lecture. And so in this part, we're covering the malicious attacks, threats and vulnerabilities that impact our IT infrastructure in organizations. So we're going to be talking about different concepts, malicious software, countermeasures, common attacks, countermeasures, social engineering, threats, different types of attacks for the wireless networks, as well as those for web type of applications. Keeping in mind that from a global perspective, and a national perspective here in Canada, malicious attacks have been increasing. And so this is really a global phenomenon. There's many different factors that come to play in this situation, because the cyber criminals, and we'll talk a little bit more about who they are, but so criminals who use the cyber means to commit their crimes, typically fraud through theft of identity or theft of money, of fiat currency, but in our case, virtual currencies, and so cyber currencies, cryptocurrencies, all different types of monetary values. So fiat currency being like, hard cash. Obviously, that's not directly circulating through the internet, but there's things that can easily be converted into cash, or that have a value that can be relatively interesting for the cyber criminals. However, because of the way the economy has evolved in the last few years, and certainly with the dominance of telecommunications, smartphones, the internet as tools for business, then the opportunities to use those tools in a mischievous way as a way to acquire wealth or to acquire things of value has significantly increased, thus becoming very interesting or very high potential of interest for cyber criminals to use the cyber technology as a tool in the commission of a crime, or in some cases the crime being related directly to the technology. And so this, we've seen this certainly all kinds of statistics showing that this is increasing. This is increasing both in the private sector, so companies, financial institutions, banks, all kinds of cyber crimes that are affecting all kinds of companies, and we'll be talking a lot more about those. And also the public sector. We've seen in the last few months, for example, an increase of ransomware attacks on government agencies, both in Canada and in the US. This has increased quite a bit in the last few months. And so through a phishing attack, where a cyber criminal will send emails to the government agency. Somebody there is going to open that email, unknowingly will be installing an encryption software on their network, and in order to so this will encrypt all the data. In order to decrypt the data, the government agency, will be required to pay a fee to the cyber criminals, typically in bitcoins. So that's known as the ransomware attack, where I'm holding your data ransom, sort of like a kidnapping kind of thing. And so there's been a very big increase of those types of attacks, particularly to municipal government agencies, small or medium-sized cities that don't necessarily have the means and the staff to put in place a complex cybersecurity infrastructure, and who have ended up paying in many cases, which is perhaps not the recommended strategy, to pay them. But when you need your data back, and the cyber criminals, if they want this to work, they don't have a choice. They have to give you access back to your data when you pay, because then otherwise no one would pay anymore. So it's a business, right? There's people who make this their business, and they're very, very successful at it. We've seen an increase of attacks coming from some countries. China, for example, has shown a big increase, but the US as well. So we, as cybersecurity professionals working in organizations, we have things that we need to protect because they have value to us. And so we have, for example, customer data. That is one element. And so in order to do business, we require customers to give us access to their data, because in some cases we're legally obliged to get the data. Like in the financial sector, we need things like your social security number, your address, your name, and some information that will allow us to identify who you are, like the maiden name of your mother and things like that. But this has value to cyber criminals because they can use this information in all kinds of ways to do identity theft, identity fraud, or they can just use it to acquire goods and services in your name. So this, for us as a business, this has value. If this gets stolen, we'll have all kinds of significant impacts for the organizations, such as loss of reputation is certainly one that will significantly impact the organization, particularly if we don't do a good job at managing the crisis, and also if we're not prepared to react when such a thing happens. We have network infrastructure, computer systems, IT infrastructure that need to be protected, because we rely on those systems in order to do our business. We have intellectual property. We've done research and development. We've developed new techniques, new tools, new products, new services. And so how we've done that work has value to us. And so that's something that we don't want to lose, and we don't want to be divulged. For example, companies in a country where they have a lot of manufacturing capabilities, who may have interest into acquiring or not acquiring, but getting a hold of our intellectual property so they can duplicate at a lower cost, and not having to invest on research and development. They can actually resell the same products at a much lower price and still be making money, because they don't have to they don't occur the additional costs that we have to allocate to the products that we're going to be making. So there's not these type of requirements. So this is, of course, very interesting. All kinds of financial data, money transfers, financial information, electronic transfer of funds. So obviously money is something that we need to protect. We need to protect the availability of our systems, make sure that their systems are up and running, because we need them in order to do our job, and to keep a high level of efficiency and productivity. And of course, I've already mentioned reputation when I talked about customer data, but reputation takes a lifetime to build, but can be lost very, very quickly. So that's something that has a lot of value to us. So if we come back to the model that we spoke in previous lectures, looking at the different domains of our information systems, there's different aspects of things that we need to protect, because in all of these different domains, in the same way that there's different capabilities, there's different aspects that may be attacked in those different domains. And we'll come back to that, because I think we'll be talking of that in the next few slides. But do keep in mind, there's all of these have different issues, potential weaknesses, and they can be attacked in different ways, all the way from the actual user to the network systems, the local systems, the wireless systems as well. So there's professionals out there that we talked about, to which we very often will refer to with the generic term of hackers. In reality, we shouldn't really be talking about hackers, because hacker is really a mindset. Hackers are traditionally, we've referred to hackers as people who are curious and who like to understand how things work. I'm a hacker, but I'm not a criminal, and that's the crackers. Cracker is the criminal hackers. So these are what been referring to as cyber criminals. So these are people who use the techniques of hacking, of trying to figure out how things work, and trying to figure out the ins and outs and weaknesses and strengths of these different components of our information systems and of our information technologies. But however, they want to use them in a mischievous way. They want to use them in a bad way. Those are the crackers. So they have a hostile intent. They have what lawyers would call mens rea, criminal intent. And so they are knowingly and willingly doing something that is illegal, with the intent of profiting in a way, very often financially, from that criminal activity that they're performing. So they are a great threat to us, these criminals. Now, we shouldn't think of criminals as, a 30-year-old male living with his parents, working out of his basement. Or the classical image that you're going to see maybe in some movies, right? Or that you've seen in the past in movies. Very often, these criminals can be actual employees, people working in your organization, as well as being organized criminal groups. So we have the whole gamut of cyber criminals that exist, that are out there. We tend to categorize them in three broad categories, and this refers to the old cowboy movies, where in the old cowboys movies you'd have the good guy and the bad guy, and the bad guy would always have a black hat, and the good guy would always have a white cowboy hat. That's the white hat hacker. The white hat hacker is somebody who's using the same techniques as a cyber criminal, but he's using them from inside the organization as a way to continuously test and push the envelope on the organization's cybersecurity, in order to identify what are the potential vulnerabilities that we have, what are the potential things that we have that may cause a problem that a black hat, the actual criminal, might actually exploit in a way that it would cause some kind of damages to us. So the black hat and the white hat are really sort of the same profile of individual, but one's doing it for the organization, working for the organization, or hired on contract for the organization, typically part of a team of white hat hackers that is known as the red team, or also as offensive cybersecurity. So this is a group of, very often tends to be more male, but although that is less and less true, tends to be relatively young, although that is less and less true as well. working inside of the organization with a sort of, a special image or special kind of expertise, that continuously pushing the envelope and trying to identify vulnerabilities. And when they find a problem, the red team will then go to another team called the blue team. And the blue team is defensive cybersecurity. And they're going to give them this information. And then they're going to use this information to make changes to the architecture, the infrastructure, the systems, the processes, in order to plug that hole, to ensure that the hole that we've identified ourselves that didn't come out of the hacker community, we've actually fixed that issue. And then between the gray, the black and the white, there's the gray, and the gray is the hacker who will try to discover vulnerabilities, but not necessarily exploit them for his own benefit. So no mens rea, no intent to exploit the vulnerability in a criminal manner. But once he finds a vulnerability, typically what the gray hat will do is he will divulge this through a process that exists. That maybe if we have time, we can talk about this. But there's basically a whole process of how people will go to different websites where they bug tracks and things like places like that, where they will send this. So there's a process, and they will contact the company. They will inform them, hey, we found a bug, we found a vulnerability, we found something that a hacker might want to exploit, and so we're letting you know so you have time to fix it. And then a few weeks later, it will be eventually divulged to the public that this exists. Typically divulged about at the same time where a service pack or patch of some kind is released so that we can fix this issue. Many organizations have a bug bounty program, whereas so many of these gray hat hackers, when they find these vulnerabilities and they divulge them to the company, they somehow get paid for their work that they've done. And this is sometimes referred to as bug bounty. So organizations have processes in place in order to do that. Sometimes maybe they'll do competitions or events, something called a CTF, a capture the flag type of event, which I hope that I'll have the opportunity to invite you at one of these events towards the middle or the end of the semester. I collaborate in the organization of some of these events through my employer, and so we can hopefully, this year is of course a bit special because of everything that's going on in the world, but hopefully I'll be able to invite you to one of these events. So these are the gray hats. Now there's a lot of tools that the hackers or crackers may use. Again, the hackers do it generally for good and to learn and to figure out how things work, whereas the crackers are doing it in a criminal manner. But in both cases, like people like me, hackers, we typically do it in a lab setting, or like we're doing in this course using a virtualized environment. So we're not actually going out on the web trying to hack people. And we use all kinds of tools. So because we're doing this on the web, we're trying to understand the web traffic, the data that's circulating on the network, and this will give us a lot of information. And that's the protocol analyzers, Wireshark that we're using in some of our labs that we're doing in this class. We'll using something called a port scanner. So we're looking at the TCP/IP protocol, and we know TCP/IP. So there's a network address, a host address, and then there's the different ports that are being used on these different hosts. And so we know what these ports mean because many of them are well documented, and others, by convention, we know certain software use certain ports. So if we can go and scan ports, then we could really get a lot of information to try to understand what is this machine potential target that we have. And we can really find a lot of information if we scan and we analyze the results. So of course, if you don't want to get caught as a hacker, if you're doing this and you don't want to get caught, you want to do this in a very, very discreet manner. You don't want to just go out and start scanning everything. You'll get caught right away. But it's the basic technique. Then based on the different ports, the different protocols that are being used, the different information that we can see. We typically can be able to fingerprint the operating system that is used. So we can basically figure out, depending on the certain combinations of ports and services, we have tools that will help us figure out, okay, what's the operating system of this host that we're trying to attack. Then we can also use vulnerability scanners, like Nessus, for example, is a well-known one. There's a lot of communication, some professional tools that are available that we can acquire, that businesses will typically acquire, but we're not going to be using them because they're very, very expensive. But you can easily find information about those. And so those are going to actually run some exploits. So they're going to test certain things based on common attacks, known attacks that are out there. And so we're going to basically run scripts, and we're going to try to see if those machines, those hosts, are susceptible to these vulnerabilities. We can also do war dialing. War dialing was how I got started a long time ago. We just dial phone numbers with modems and hope we get onto a computer. 30 years ago, this would actually work because there wasn't really much security out there. Today, we don't really use modems anymore, so that's typically not something that we would do. But what we would do is drive around in a car with a wireless Wi-Fi adapter and try to get into people's wireless networks. And something that I used to do in another course that I was teaching a few years ago on wireless networking security, and we would do that. We would do war drives with the students around the city of Montreal, and we'd find a lot of easily accessible wireless networks. Of course, we wouldn't go in because that would be illegal. We were just identifying where they were and that they existed. There's tools that we can use. So once we found a machine, we know the operating system. There's different tools that we can use to try to figure out what the user ID and passwords are. Well, we have a good idea what the user IDs could be because we've done our research and part of our recon phase. But we can use some tools like Loftcrack and other tools that I've been using over the years that will do different types of attacks on passwords. Either a dictionary attack, so trying words from the dictionary, or a brute force attack, trying to figure out every single combination of letters and numbers that could potentially work. And so typically this will work. The issue being that if complex passwords are used, this would take a fair amount of time. The more complex, the longer it will take. And so ideally, the organization will be forcing users to change their password in less time than it will take to figure out complex passwords. So, if I have enough processing power and I have the right software, maybe I can figure out your event. Doing a brute force attack, maybe it'll take me 20 days to change the password, to figure out the password. So if users change their password every 2 weeks, then I would probably, most likely I would just never be able to catch up. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. And then finally, if I'm able to get in to the machine, or I have a physical access to the machine, I can install a keystroke logger that will basically capture everything that people type on the keyboard, bypassing pretty much all of the security and sending the information through the internet to me. This happened at the university a few years ago, I think 3 years ago. Somebody installed keystroke loggers on the library computers at the university. And so people went to the library, used the computers there, and perhaps did some banking or some other stuff. And somebody had access to all of their information because they actually could get your password because they knew what keys you were typing. So this is this kind of thing, this type of tool, attack tool that can be used. And there's some others, but these are just the more common ones. So if you remember from, I think was the first week, we talked about CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, availability of security, the main things that we're trying to protect for our data. So we want our data to stay confidential, not be divulged to unauthorized users. We don't want our data to be altered without our knowing or accidentally, so the integrity. And also we need the data to be available when we need the data, so the availability of the data. So anything that will affect those three things, those are security breaches. Anything that will disrupt what the system is supposed to be doing, or why we are using the system as part of our doing business, that would be a security breach. Anything that will, cause damage as the result of a accidental or voluntary hardware or software failure, this would be a security breach. So there's a type of system called a SCADA, the systems that are used to control the utilities, the electricity, the street lights, the water, the drinking water in cities. A system like that could be voluntarily damaged by a foreign government in preparation for an attack on the country, which would be, this would be a security breach, and this would be more of an accidental or voluntary, but appears like an accident, and would have indirect consequences. An employee who steals customer data and gives it or sells it to a competitor or to a third party, this would definitely be a security breach, a violation of the confidentiality. In this case, because confidentiality is a legal requirement that we have due to privacy laws, we have to protect the privacy of our customers, and so, which means for us we need to keep the customer data confidential. So we keep it confidential because it is private, and we have a legal obligation to keep it confidential when it is private. And so if somebody divulges the information without the permission of the owner, or in this case the customer, or uses it in a mischievous way, right, this would be a security breach. And if I have a system that I need to use in order to do my normal daily operations, but all my data is locked because there was ransomware, and then all my data was encrypted, and I can't use my systems anymore. So this would disrupt how I can use the system. This would be a security breach. And so this can happen in just so many ways. I mean, if we really wanted to make a list of all of those, I think we'd be here all day. But we're going to cover a few of them that I think are of more interest to us. So that at least we may want to that you should know about, and that are going to be covered. So that are the most common ones. So one that's the first one is the denial of service attack. So basically, if I can keep your servers so busy that they're not able to do what they're supposed to be doing, that's a denial of service attack. And I would typically do this in two ways. So I would just flood your computer with all kinds of useless data, useless packets, and eventually it's going to be too busy. That's one way. And the other way that I'm going to do it is the next slide, which is the distributed denial of service attack, which is really the more common way to do it. So instead of having just one machine sending you data, sending you packets through the network, I'm going to have a whole bunch of machines that I'm going to co-opt into some kind of zombie army of machines that is going to be available. So I've previously hacked all these machines in all kinds of ways, getting people to click on stuff through a mass email phishing attack. And then once I have control of these machines, then when I'm ready, I can have all of these machines flooding your servers or your machines with useless traffic. So while your machines are doing that, handling this useless traffic, they're not able to do what they're supposed to be doing. So that's the distributed denial of service attack, but it's basically the same thing. So in here, this is something that I'm going to protect from in many ways. So in how I'm configuring my routers, how I'm configuring the routers of my internet service providers, and asking them to also to put in place an infrastructure where I'm going to have certain devices that are going to be able to block these kind of packets. something called an intrusion prevention system or an intrusion detection system, which are basically the same thing. I'm looking at the data like a firewall, and then when I see something that shouldn't be there, I'm going to send an alert. That's a detection system. Or I'm even going to do some actions like close some ports or close some things on my network infrastructure, and that's the IPS, the intrusion prevention system. So the prevention is going to be active, the detection is going to be passive and just letting me know there's an issue. Of course, sometimes it'll generate a lot of false positives, and this is one of the big issues of these, and how reliable these systems are have a lot to do with how good they are at identifying false positives. Because if I'm spending all my energy trying to prevent things that aren't really problems, false positives, then I'm wasting my time. Eventually I'm going to give up on using the system. I'm just not going to use it anymore. So I already talked about the DDoS, so same thing, just from multiple sources at the same time. Unacceptable web browsing, so I need to have a policy in place, and I want to make sure that my users aren't doing what they're not supposed to be doing. So I'm going to create a policy, but also I want to have mechanisms in place and filters and tools that are going to be ensuring that my policy is going to be respected. And so because I want to make sure that when people are opening up files or going to certain websites, there's certain activities that I don't want them to be doing. There's certain things that I don't want them to open. I also don't want them to become a backdoor, to become a vulnerability in creating a backdoor into my network by doing these kinds of things. So wiretapping, so basically listening either in an active or a passive way, listening to the network traffic, acting as a sort of man in the middle and looking at all the traffic. Typically, we see this in the airport setting, for example, or an internet cafe or a coffee shop where people go to telework and a co-working space, and then somebody would put in, you would set up their computer so it looks like it's a wireless access point, and having legitimate users are connecting to it, to the wireless network because they want to do stuff, but in reality they're not connecting to the network of the cafe. They're connecting to the person's computer, and then he's sending them off to the internet through there, but filtering all the traffic as it goes through. We've seen cases of that, like in Starbucks, but also in airports. We can also see that if you have physical access to a wired network, it's the kind of thing that people may want to do. What is more common, perhaps, or easier, is the passive filtering, just sniffing, just looking at the traffic going by. This is sort of what you guys are doing in the lab with the Wireshark. This is sort of kind of thing, looking at the traffic and trying to make some sense of the traffic. Typically, backdoors are accesses that are created either unknowingly knowingly by developers who want to give themselves a way to come in and do support, perhaps, but who may also, once they get fired, the employees, there's been cases of people coming in their old employers after they've been fired and using this backdoor to do things that they weren't supposed to do, like lock access to files or delete stuff. And of course, hackers can create backdoors or use backdoors that they've figured out through port scanning, perhaps, or other means, that they are there. Through exploration, they found that certain software has this backdoor built into it somehow, perhaps an operating system or a database system that's commonly used has a door, and it's not documented, but they found it. So they're able to use that to get access to systems, and so they'll go in and they'll modify data, they'll access data, they'll copy data, all kinds of different things that they're going to be doing in this way. So additional challenges. Not sure what's the intent here, but definitely the idea of spam, right? And so a lot of spam going around and getting people to click on stuff and do things that they're not supposed to be doing, using cookies off websites in order to get away into your web browser and to get access to a lot of information that way, and to also look at those cookies that are providing a lot of information about what you're doing. So risk is the possibility of something going bad, right? Of something not happening like it's supposed to. And the next presentation part of today's class, we'll be talking about that a bit more. Threats, so the actions that can cause compromission or damage to an asset. And vulnerabilities, these are the weaknesses. These are the things that we're looking at. Now, what we need to understand is that threats will exploit vulnerabilities, and by exploiting vulnerabilities, they can result some damages. And so this is what risk is. So and again, we'll talk more about that in the second lecture, but just keep in mind it's the exploitation of a vulnerability by a threat that is the problem of risk. We can't eliminate risk. Risk is always going to be present. And every time there's opportunities, there has to be risk. It's a side effect of opportunities that there's going to be risk. But what we can do is we can try to reduce the impact. So if something actually happens that will cause us damages, right? We can also eliminate the vulnerabilities as much as we can. So those are really the big things that we're trying to do in cybersecurity. So if a threat exploits a vulnerability, there's going to be an impact. How can we minimize the impact? For example, by making backups, we're not going to prevent some kind of problem. But if it does happen, we can restore the backup. So the impact is going to be damaged. Also, we can put in place some mechanisms like antivirus, for example, that is not going to prevent the virus, but if the virus does arrive, it's not going to affect our systems. But we have mechanisms in place to prevent the likelihood that the threat will exploit the vulnerability. Instead of exploiting the vulnerability, we're just going to quarantine the virus, and so it's not going to have the opportunity to make any damages. So those are basically the things that we do in cybersecurity. If something happens, minimize the impact, or try to figure out a way that it's less likely that this is going to be happening. So we can minimize threats and reduce vulnerabilities as a way to reduce the overall risk. And because threats, risk, and vulnerabilities, they can negatively impact the CIA triad that we have. So this is confidentiality. So threats exploiting vulnerabilities may affect the confidentiality of our data, may affect the integrity of our data, may affect the availability of our data. And so anything that may affect those three things is a bad thing. And so we're trying to figure out ways that this isn't going to happen. So some of the common threats, malicious software, hardware, software failures, internal attacks, equipment theft, external hackers, natural disasters, industrial espionage, terrorism. Some of them we spend a lot of energy trying to focus on, and we're not necessarily always focusing on the right thing. But anyway, we'll talk about that and probably a lot more in the discussions that we're going to have about this. So disclosure threats, sabotage, espionage. So this is confidentiality. Alteration threats. So this is integrity, unauthorized changes. Availability, things that may affect the availability. So denial or destruction threats, like the DOS, the denial of service attacks that I talked about before. So a malicious attack, so a bad thing happening to us, may come in 4 categories. So fabrication, interceptions, interruptions, or modifications. Those are the 4 big categories that we can put them into. Some are active threats. So things like birthday attacks, brute force password attacks, dictionary attack, I talked about that. Spoofing an IP address, or looking like my computer is something when it's something else. My personal favorite, social engineering, which we'll talk about. Phishing attacks. I'm sure you all know what phishing attacks are. So let's move on. Malicious software, so software that can cause damages, that can escalate security privileges, divulge data, or modify or delete data, So there's all kinds of categories in there, such as viruses. I'm pretty sure you must all know what a virus is, right? So a virus is a file that will copy itself, so just like the COVID virus or other viruses, and it's going to spread and it's going to infect the host, in this case the host programs, and it'll replicate itself to other machines, eventually slowing down the computers, but also potentially causing other problems. A worm is a self-contained program that replicates and sends copies of itself to other computers without any user input or action. It doesn't really need a host program. It's a standalone program. It's there and it's just growing and growing and growing. And at some point it'll do something, like, for example, enabling the creation of the zombie army I talked about before when we were doing a denial of service attack. Typically a worm is a way that I would propagate the information. A Trojan horse, so just like the Athenians and the Trojans, gifting this horse in honor of the Trojans, and while they're sleeping at night, they come out of the horse and they cut everyone's throat. So this is something that looks like a legitimate software, but it's hiding something else inside, like opening up a back door or downloading files or whatever. So this is a type of system that I'm sure you've heard about before, type of software that I'm sure you've heard about. Pretty common thing. Rootkits is basically allows me to take control of the base operating system. And so it will, those are operating system specific, but it will make some changes to the operation that will basically allow me to take control of, in an administrative way, to get administrator privileges on the machine that I'm trying to attack. So this is a tool that will allow me to take control of a computer. Spyware will allow me to monitor keyboards, to scan your drives, to see what you're doing, to access your information, to change your information, maybe your website, for example. So this is, so it's a spy. It's a software that is acting as a spy for the cyber criminal and trying to figure out as much information as possible. So as I said, the common types of attacks on availability of the machine, attacks on the assets, attacks on people. Those are really the common threats. So the attack on availability, attacks that impact the access or the uptime of a critical system of applications of data. Attack on people. These attacks would involve using coercion or deception to get another human to divulge information or to perform an action, like clicking on a URL, for example, or an email attachment from an unknown email address. Attacks on IT assets, so in penetration testing, unauthorized access, privilege escalation, stolen password, deletion of data, or performing a data breach of some form. So my personal favorite, I guess the most fun, would be social engineering. So here is an attack where we're going to try to get people to give us as much information as they can, and then we're going to use that information as a way to gain access and then perform some kind of cybercrime. Typically, when we have the big capture the flag events, we usually have a cyber social engineering competition. And I think the last one I was at, the winner of the competition was able to get someone to give them their user password and login information in less than 5 minutes. So here, of course, in the context of these CTFs, they're typically subsidized and organized through a particular organization who gives us permission to run this as a penetration test. It's good for them because it allows them to test their security, and of course, with the knowledge that this isn't going to be done in a criminal way, but certainly criminals can do the same thing and are really, really good at it. Kevin Mitnick being the king of this. If you don't know who Kevin Mitnick is, you might want to Google it. And there's some really good videos out there, and even movies were made about this guy. But he was the king of social engineering. So different types: authority, using a position of authority to coerce or to persuade an individual to divulge information. So I call you and I say, hey, this is Mark from the IT support department. We're having a problem. Can I get you to try to log in? Oh, yeah. Oh, no, it's not working. I don't see you on the console. Maybe let me try on my side. What's your user ID? Okay. And what's your password? Oh, okay. People will give it, surprisingly. So there's all kinds of ways. A consensus, using a position that everyone else has been doing as proof that it's okay to do it. Dumpster diving, just going in the dumpster behind the company and just finding pieces of paper that are there that has all kinds of information on it. Familiarity, liking, so interacting with the victim in a frequent way that creates a comfort and familiarity. And linking for an individual. This is, typically a lot of crimes are done this way. They'll call an elderly person and start talking to them, being really friendly and everything, and eventually getting them to do something. A hoax, so a con, a false perception in order to get an individual to do something or to divulge information. So this is your typical confidence scheme. Con man, as we know. Impersonation, so pretending to be somebody else, like your nephew, calling your grandmother and getting her to do something. Intimidation, so using force to extort or pressure an individual in doing something or divulging information. We see that, for example, in the foreign bride scheme or the love scheme, where I'm going to get you to do something and then through trust, and then I'm going to intimidate you, saying if you don't do this, I'm going to publish these pictures or whatever. Trust, so building a human trust bond over time and then using that trust to get the individual to do something or to divulge some information. Scarcity, so pressuring another individual into doing something or divulging information for fear of not having something or losing access to something. Shoulder surfing, just looking over somebody's shoulder, see what they're doing. Tailgating, so just following them. Urgency, so using urgency or an emergency stress situation to get somebody to do something. Phishing, so this is a phishing attack by telephone in order to elicit some personal information. And then whaling, so targeting the executive user or a most valuable employee, otherwise considered as the whale or the big fish, right? So those are, so phishing is sending a whole bunch of emails. Phishing is doing this sort of the same thing but using the phone, and whaling is just targeting the big whale. But they're similar kind of things, so do keep those in mind. In wireless networks, we have some different versions of that, different types of attacks as well that we're going to see. So I think we're already nearly an hour into this. I don't necessarily want to go through the details of all of them, but you can look these up. I do want to mention a couple. The IV attack, where I can sniff the network and eventually get in for information so I can get into and log in as a legitimate user. I talked about war driving already before, and just basic sniffing where I can do that. From a web point of view, a buffer overflows, so like in the denial of service attack kind of thing. Also SQL or XML injection, where I'm just kind of, if systems are not well protected and there's not any good security mechanisms in place, I can actually send special URLs basically that I'm sending to the machine, but that contain some code inside of them that I'm going to get the machine to execute. So we're going to be looking at countermeasures, and so what is it that I can do in order to block these things, right? So what are the different ways that I can do, and also who can I talk to? Where can I get some help if I'm having some issues with some of these aspects? So different type of countermeasures. So the vulnerability detections. And this is what typically my red team is going to be doing, and my blue team is going to be doing in an active or in a passive way. I'm going to have people who are going to be looking at publications, doing research, trying to figure out if there's vulnerabilities that have been identified that may be useful to me. so that maybe I potentially have on my network. And so that's one way that I'm going to work at the detection of vulnerabilities. Also, I'm going to put mechanisms in place to try to block some of these attacks. And if an attack does happen, I'm going to have something called a incident management program, a disaster recovery plan, business continuity plan. So if an attack does actually happen, if there is a successful attack, I'm going to be ready to react. And I'm going to have people who are going to help me in order to do that. Of course, I'm going to hire some consultants, some forensic experts, so people who know, like CSI, right? So people who know how to look at what happened and try to understand the situation. I'm going to have a war room with a security incident response team, so a group of people who are pre-identified, who are trained. We've run a whole bunch of scenarios, of simulations, so when something real actually happens, we're ready, we know what we should be doing. And then in some cases, I'm also going to deal with law enforcement agencies and law enforcement officers, LEOs, to try to apprehend and arrest and then prosecute the cyber criminals. You should be noted, however, that that's not necessarily always done. Not all of these things are going to be done. Sometimes, some organizations choose not to go to law enforcement agencies for many different reasons. One of them may be to protect their reputation, but it's not necessarily the only reason that we're going to find. So in malware, for example, so the human issues, the human weakness, the human vulnerability, all the things relating to phishing and vishing and whaling and social engineering, etc. All of these have something in common, which is the user as a vulnerability, the user at the center of my issues. And so this is where I need to do cybersecurity awareness programs. This is where I need to do education programs. This is where I need to have politics. This is where I need to publish and to have in place bulletins and things, but also to have a certain number of protocols that are going to prevent users from transferring files and transferring certain information, and all kinds of protection software like anti-malware software, antivirus software, etc., using secure logons, authentication processes. But this is something that perhaps we'll talk a little bit more in the discussions, because maybe I can give you some examples, but I don't necessarily want to post them here in this video, of real world situations and experiences that I've had. As well, there's some agencies, some organizations that are working on this. We have some examples here in the US, but we have some as well in Canada that we're going to be talking about. Finally, having firewalls in place with business rules that are controlling all this information and trying to ensure that we try to block as much as possible the security, the unauthorized things that may be trying to come into our network. So that's it for this lecture. So again, I remind you, as part of this week's class, we have 2 lectures. And so this is the first part. So thank you very much.